Hello, everyone. I am here today to talk about the use of life expectancy tables to estimate expected mortality among U.S. family forest landowners. So why are we interested in demographics of family forest landowners? And simply, land transfer is a topic that is of considerable importance right now among foresters and conservationists. It is thought that land transfer is a time of particular vulnerability to things like land development, parcellation, changes in land management practices. And so there is considerable interest in understanding when and to what extent forested land is changing hands. A couple of interesting points. 45 to 70% of wooded land in the United States changed hands between 2002 and 2018. The wide divergence of these numbers depends a little bit on whether we count transfers within families the same as transfers between families or between families and corporations. Um, but it's a significant portion of the land base changed hands. I should say the wooded land base changed hands, over an almost 20-year period. A couple of other interesting points. Age certainly increases the likelihood of land transfer in the northeastern United States. Um, as landowners get older, they are more likely to sell land, give land away, and certainly to die and leave land to other people, to family and other individuals. And also of some importance, almost 34% of family forest ownerships in the northeastern United States have no will and no other estate planning tools. And this includes over 20% of FFOs at least 75 years old. So there's a number of older landowners out there who have no formal estate planning tools in place for their wooded land. And so the methods I'm going to be talking about today have not been used very much within the family forest literature or in the broader field of forestry, but they're very common tools among health statisticians and people who study demographics, and certainly insurance agencies and other private sector organizations that are concerned about these things. And that's basically a life table approach. And we're going to be using life tables that were derived from the National Center for Health Statistics at the CDC. And the outputs of interest are two variables: 5-year survivorship, so the probability that a given landowner will survive another 5 years, and the life expectancy of landowners. And the raw data that we're going to be using with these life tables come from the National Woodland Owner Survey. And the variables are age, gender, race, and ethnicity. The National Woodland Owner Survey is a product of the United States Forest Service, FIA program, Forest Inventory and Analysis program. And it is the official national survey of forest and woodland ownerships. We're going to be using data from the 2018 cycle of the NWS, the most recent cycle of the NWS. And we are looking at a sample size of 9,524 responses during that cycle, and this represents an almost 40% cooperation rate. So for each respondent, each survey respondent, what we are doing is identifying the appropriate life table to use for that person, and we're identifying those tables based on gender, race, and ethnicity. These three variables are defined in the NWS using census definitions, and fortunately the National Center for Health Statistics also uses census definitions. So it was a very clean match between our respondents and the appropriate table to use. And there's 8 demographic categories, 8 tables based on gender, race, and ethnicity that we used. And the first 2 are Hispanic female and Hispanic male. And this is based obviously on gender and based on whether the respondent identifies as being of Hispanic ethnicity. So if they do, they're put into one of these 2 categories dependent on their identified gender. If they don't identify as being of Hispanic ethnicity, we use our race variable from that point on to figure out what category they belong in. And the next 4 are non-Hispanic black female, non-Hispanic black male, non-Hispanic white female, and non-Hispanic white male. There's a number of other races that are listed in our survey other than black and white. We have Asian and Native American and Pacific Islander. And for all of these, there's not a specific life table associated with these races. And so what we do is we use the broader generalized table for their gender. So if you identify as a female and you're not Hispanic and you don't identify as black or white, then we use the table that is valid across across all females. And similarly for males who don't identify as one of those ethnicities or races, we use the generalized male table. And once we've matched each respondent up to a table, we use age within that table in order to look up survivorship and life expectancy. And so if we look at the raw data for a moment, the first thing we see is a pretty noteworthy lack of diversity in terms of race and ethnicity. If you look at this bar chart, you see that overwhelmingly the largest proportion of responders are non-Hispanic white males. In fact, it's it's more than 76% of all of our responses are non-Hispanic white males. And if you look at the sort of teal colored bar to the immediate right of it, that's non-Hispanic white females. And that is most of the remainder. So there's an overwhelming proportion of our respondents are white. And the question of whether or not this is the real distribution of race among landowners or whether there's some kind of racial bias in our non-response is something that we're really interested in. And there's been some work that's gone into that in the NWS, and there's some underway, and there's more in the future. And so I'm not going to be talking about that today, but this is just to say that race, ethnicity, and gender are not hugely variable in our inputs, and so they're not likely to be strong drivers of our outputs. The strongest driver of our outputs is age. And the mean age among our respondents is 65.4 years old with a standard deviation of 11.7 years. Fairly normal distribution. And so this is the distribution of our respondent pool. And so this is the strongest driver of what we see in our outputs. So once we identified the appropriate life table and calculated survivorship and life expectancy for each respondent, the next step was to extrapolate from our responses to the entire population of family forest land ownerships. And to do that, we used the built-in design of the National Woodland Owner Survey. So the NWS has a probability proportional to area design. It's based on putting a number of sample points on a grid across the entire United States and identifying the owners of all of the points that fall within forest. And then from that point, what we do is we use a weighting approach that's based on an individual respondent's stated size of forest holdings. So they identify in their survey what area of forest ownership they have. And we use that, and we use the number of points that that ownership corresponded to in the sample frame. And from there, we calculate survey weights that let us make population level estimates in terms of both ownerships and area. And this is the sort of standard approach for making estimates that we use for the NWS, and it's currently in review for publication. It was used for the base estimates for the most current, the 2018 cycle, which is also currently in review for publication. And it also works very nicely for individual projects like this. And so from this point on in the presentation, what we're looking at is numbers and plots and figures that relate to the entire population of family forest ownerships, both ownerships and the number of hectares associated with those ownerships. And so the first thing we see here is the distribution of 5-year survivorship. So again, this is the probability of landowners surviving an additional 5 years. And we calculate the mean for the entire population to be 0.89. So landowners have, across the United States, FFOs have an 89% chance of surviving in another 5 years. Conversely, there is a more than 10% chance for any given landowner to die within the next 5 years. So a related metric, of course, is life expectancy. And a note here, this is not total life expectancy. A lot of times when we hear the term life expectancy, what we're really looking at is life expectancy from birth or life expectancy from age 1 or something like that. So we're used to seeing things in terms of, 89 years or something like that. What we're looking at here is life expectancy from the point of calculation. So how many years are left, or are expected years do our respondents have remaining. And we see here a mean of 21 years. So the current cohort of landowners has a mean of 21 years of expected life yet to live. And again, we see this fairly normally distributed and largely following the or largely mapped onto, let's say, the distribution of age, which is the driving variable. What is nice about the NWS weighting approach is that we can also calculate totals and means in terms of area, land area, and that allows us to answer questions like what proportion of the land base is owned by people with a shorter life expectancy. And so if land transfer is a concern because we think it might trigger undesirable management and land transformation sort of things, parcellation, clearing, development, that type of thing. We might want to know what proportion of the land is currently owned by folks that might not have such a long time to live. And what we see here is that 85% or more of the actual forested area in the United States is currently owned by people with greater than 10 years to live. So that shows that we're not possibly looking at immediate mortality-driven land transfer. But on the flip side of that, 2.5 million hectares is currently owned by people who have less than 5 years to live. And so one might expect a good amount of that land to, or actually one might expect all of that land to change hands within 5 years. And that is a good segue to the second half of this presentation, which is a modeling exercise. And basically we wanted to do, we're going to be presenting some very simple models where we kind of wanted to look at how do we believe land is going to transfer from the current cohort of landowners to the next cohort of landowners. And we did these very simple models, taking the life expectancy from the tables, and we looked at another variable from the NWS, who will receive land. So basically in the NWS, we asked landowners who is likely to receive your land when you sell it or give it away or die. And it has these categories: children, family, other individuals, corporate, and government. And so based on these two variables, we see a pattern like this, where within the first, let's say, 10 years, most landowners are holding on to their land. And then as time goes on, more and more of those landowners are dying and transferring the land. And the people that they're transferring it to are largely family, children, and to some extent other individuals. And again, this is the base case of our model. It's a very simple assumption where we're assuming landowners hold on to their land until they die, and then they transfer it to the people that they've identified as the likely next owners of the land. But obviously landowners do not in all cases hang on to land until they die. So what about transfers before death? And for that, we're looking at yet another variable for the NWS, where we ask people what is the likelihood that they're going to transfer their land in the next 5 years. And it's a Likert scale question from extremely unlikely to extremely likely. And so for the purpose of our model, we mapped some probabilities onto these categories. Ranging from 0% in each 5-year step. So if somebody answered extremely unlikely, they're not going to give away their land until they die. If someone said they're extremely likely, we chose 100% likelihood. So they definitely transfer their land in the next 5 years, regardless of whether or not they live longer than that. And in between, there's some 0 to 1 probability that the landowner transfers their land within each 5-year time step of the model. And so this is kind of what we're calling the less aggressive early transfer case. We're calling this early A. It's less aggressive, but we looked at a more aggressive interpretation of these categories. We said, well, what if landowners are more likely to give away their land in the next 5 years than they might think? And in this case, we said that everyone who is undecided or higher is definitely going to transfer their land. People who think they're extremely likely are still going to hang on to it until they die, and people who think it's unlikely still have a 50% chance of transferring their land within each 5-year time step. And so this is basically a way of bookending our very simple model, and saying that, things come up, landowners need land, or their health takes a turn for the worst. And so, maybe it's likely here that landowners are kind of underestimating the speed at which they're going to want to give this land away. And so what we can see here are the three models. We see the mortality only. We see the mortality plus early, the less aggressive, and the mortality plus early B, the more aggressive. And you can see that the biggest difference is in the early years of the model. So if you look in 2020, you can see that assuming a very aggressive early transfer almost doubles the amount of land that's going to be transferred in the next 10 years, 10 or 15 years. But as time goes on, mortality catches up with everybody. And so folks who haven't transferred it early still die, and the land changes hands. So the effect makes less of a difference as time goes on. But this strongly affects how much short-term land changes hands. But the other thing to look at when you look at these three curves is that mortality alone, if you look at the area above the curve and you interpret that as the amount of land, the total amount of land that's currently owned changing hands, you can see that mortality is the lion's share of that area. So it's definitely a larger total effect across the entire frame that we're looking at. So another slice of our modeling is, what if landowners are wrong about who will receive their land? So what if they, they want their children, they want their nieces and nephews to get their land, but maybe those younger folks don't want the land, or can't afford the taxes, or inherit it but turn right around and sell it. And so we used another variable, and instead of looking at the variable where we asked landowners to say who they think is going to get the land, we looked at who they got the land from. So in other words, we said, what if the overall distribution from past transfers is true of future transfers? If the same overall distribution of the current cohort remains true down the road. And that is just another way of looking at this question and trying to tease out how, we don't know to what extent landowners' personal assessments of who will receive their land, how accurate those are. And so this is another way of looking at that. And if you look here across the entire suite of 6 flavors of this model, you see the columns are defined by how we got the distribution of recipients. So the first one, the leftmost column, is when we used past transfers as an indication of future transfers. The rightmost column instead uses landowners' own personal assessments of who is going to get their land. From the top to the bottom, the rows are, the top row is the model where mortality alone triggers a transfer of land. And then you have the middle row is early A, and the bottom row is early B. So the less aggressive and the more aggressive interpretation of early transfer. And what you see is, as you go from the top to the bottom, you see more land change hands more quickly if we assume landowners are going to give away land before they die. That makes sense. When you look from the left to the right, you see that there's a big difference in who is going to receive the land. Landowners themselves believe it's largely children and family who are going to receive the land. But if we use the past transfer distributions as an indicator of future, we see that it's actually much more likely for other individuals and then family and children to get the land. And so that's a really interesting question that comes out of this is there something different about this cohort of landowners where, they may have not gotten it from their families, but they're going to leave it to their families? Or is this more a question of rose-colored glasses and who they would like to receive the land? So a few simple conclusions from the modeling exercise. Mortality is likely to be the main long-term driver of land transfer for the current cohort. But elective transfers, selling and giving away of land, are likely to significantly increase land transfer in the short term. We don't know who is going to receive the land, but the assumptions that we make matter. So do we trust self-reported indicators of who is going to receive the land, or do we go by past transfers and assume that distribution is going to hold? We just don't know, but the assumptions make a big deal. And finally, 2.5 million hectares are owned by people with a life expectancy of less than 5 years, many of which, based on other research, we may assume would be without a will or any other kind of estate planning instruments in place. And so these are some very simple conclusions from, again, a very simple model. Future plans with this are to look at some more nuanced and complex and robust models do longer term models where we look at possibly multiple cohorts, so not just where do current landowners transfer their land, but how long does it remain in the secondary owners before going on to tertiary owners, looking at potential impacts of land transfer on the land base, things like that. This is the very early stages of this project. But we're excited by the basic methodology, and we think some of these really broad, really early conclusions are also very interesting. So I think there's going to be an option to do some questions using the chat feature, so I'd be happy to take some of those. And if not, thank you.